Today I'd like to continue our discussion of ecology, really focusing on ecology itself today. Keeping in mind that really our perspective here is going to be really from a management standpoint of ecosystems and kind of a human ecology type of perspective. So the word ecology comes from the Latin, or the prefix here, ecos, comes from the Latin ecos, which means house. And so ecology then, we're really studying our house, or in effect, studying nature. And when we look at nature in trying to lend some structure to this, or to kind of divide it up so it has some meaning to us, we generally look at nature as being composed of both biotic factors, living factors, and abiotic factors, which are the non-living factors. So among the abiotic factors then, we have the atmosphere. The atmosphere would be the gases that we find in nature, and that would include obviously the atmosphere, the air that we breathe, but it would also include gases that we find dissolved in the soil, dissolved in water and ice, and so on. So any place that gases exist are part of the atmosphere. The hydrosphere then would be water in its many forms and many locations. So it would include liquid water, solid water, and again, lakes, rivers, streams, that kind of thing. But also, it would also include water vapor, clouds. It would also include water in the soil, aquifers, those kinds of things, and also ice. Any form of water anywhere is hydrosphere. And then lithosphere, prefix lithos is a reference to rock, and so again the many forms of rock, which could include soil, the rocks themselves that make up mountains and so on, again the soils, also sediments that we find dissolved in water, lakes, and so on. So again, the rocky component of the world in of its many different forms. And then last but not least, energy. Is also an abiotic factor. And also, again, keep in mind, we'll come back to this later, but kind of a theme to understand about how nature functions also is that the physical components of nature, basically get recycled. And we'll talk about those cycles later. But energy flows through ecosystems. And again, we've talked about that in previous modules. Okay, now the biotic factors then begin with the organism. And so the organism is the individual organism. So in this case, it might be the individual bison, or an individual bird, or individual blade of grass, individual chaparral plant, sagebrush, and so on. So that constitutes an organism. A population is a group of like organisms. So we can have a population of bison, a population of sagebrush, a population of a certain kind of grass, and so on. A natural community, in turn, is a group of populations interacting with one another. So again, here our natural community would be the bison, the sagebrush, the grasses, fungi, bacteria. Every living component of that ecosystem interacting with one another constitutes the natural community. Then some other terms that build from this then is the term ecosystem. An ecosystem is kind of the basic unit of ecology. And an ecosystem then would be a natural community of organisms interacting with themselves and the physical environment. And beyond that then, a landscape would then be adjacent or a group of ecosystems in a certain region interacting with one another. And then the biosphere, the ecosphere then would be the sum total of all ecosystems on the planet. All right, this also then, these terms kind of lend themselves to the different sub-disciplines of ecology. So there's, so-called organismal biology, organismal ecology, where you're focusing on characteristics of the organisms, and population ecology, where you're interested in how populations interact with one another, and community ecology, and ecosystem ecology, global ecology, and then, as I've mentioned, conservation ecology, where you focus on, the role of conservation in maintaining ecosystems, evolutionary ecology, how evolution played a role in the evolution of the natural communities and organisms that we see, and so on. So within the major discipline of ecology, which is a subdiscipline of biology, there's still a number of other subdisciplines. Okay, now I want to begin to talk about ecosystems, again, because they're kind of the basic unit that we discuss in ecology. And I'm going to begin with some marine ecosystems. And while I'm not going to really focus on specific marine ecosystems because there are so many, I do want to focus on some of the characteristics, physical characteristics of marine ecosystems, although I won't be focusing on specific ecosystems. So again, if we look at the oceans then, and some of the regions that we find and the types of organisms we'll find within those regions, first is the intertidal zone. And so the intertidal zone would be the region from the year's lowest tide to to the year's highest tide rather. And again, this intertidal zone or intertidal region then can be highly variable. It's dependent upon, and again, there would be a number of different intertidal ecosystems, dozens and dozens of these. So intertidal ecosystems would be influenced, for example, by whether the shore is sandy or rocky or some combination of that. Perhaps even the slope of the shoreline could play a role here. Also, where you are in terms of latitudes. Is it tropical, subtropical, Arctic, subarctic, temperate? All of those kinds of things would influence, what type of specific ecosystems we find within the intertidal zone. The neritic zone, sometimes called coastal littoral zone, then would just be essentially the shoreline regions, places that are underwater year-round but within the shallows. The continental shelf extends out anywhere from miles to hundreds of miles, which are extensions of the continents. The continental slope then is where the continental shelf drops off and the depths increase dramatically as you go into the continental slope. And again, continental shelf and continental slope then would constitute, there again could be dozens of different ecosystems in both of these. I also want to mention too that the continental shelf historically has been among the most productive regions of the oceans. And the reason for this is that we do have runoff coming from the continental masses in rivers and streams and that kind of thing. They bring nutrients to the oceans. Those nutrients then help plankton, phytoplankton, and algae grow. They form the base of the food chain, and so you'll have a lot of biomass here. You'll have a lot of productivity in the coastal regions and the continental shelf. The open ocean, on the other hand, the oceanic zone, sometimes is described as a biological desert. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but depending where you are in the ocean, this can be actually quite nutrient poor, and so then you'll have relatively few algae, and then the consumers then will be a smaller number as well. So the density of life is much lower in the open ocean than it is along the continental shelves. All right, so in this oceanic zone then, in this water column then, the euphotic zone would be the water within which light penetrates with an intensity that permits photosynthesis to occur. So again, this is where there's going to be more life. Deep to that is the bathyal zone. And this would be deep to the euphotic zone, and here light penetrates, at least in the upper regions, but not to a density or concentration that would permit photosynthesis. And then the abyssal zone will be the deepest region, and here there is no detectable light in the abyssal zone. Also, animals that are living along a surface, along the bottom, whether it's in the deep ocean or the continental slope, continental shelf, we refer to as benthic animals. And so this is sometimes called the benthic zone, where there's an actual surface for organisms to attach to. And then again, within this aphotic zone, which is subdivided again into the bathyal and abyssal zones, we also refer to this as a pelagic zone because, again, animals that are free swimming as opposed to living on the bottom, we refer to as pelagic animals. All right, so that gives us some of the regions in our marine ecosystems. Now, we also have aquatic ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems, and these are known as lentic ecosystems. And again, there's some different regions here and a variety of different ecosystems that I'll be talking about. But when we look at the shallows of a lake, this is known as the littoral zone, as opposed to the open lake, which is the limnetic zone. And again, there will be in the water column a photic zone where, again, light penetrates and allows photosynthesis. Aphotic zone would be deep to that. And again, we would also have our benthic communities along the bottom, as well as our pelagic zone where animals would be free swimming. When we look at lake ecosystems, again, it kind of depends on the size of the lake, but one of the things that happens here is that there will be turnover of water at certain times of the year. And we can get stratification of water. And the problem with that is that if water does not mix regularly, you end up with water at the bottom of the lake, being high in nutrients and low in oxygen, and at the top, low in nutrients and high in oxygen. And so by turning over, this generates a redistribution of both nutrients and oxygen. So again, in winter, in some lakes you'll at least get freezing over, and so the water will be near freezing there. And actually, at about 4 degrees centigrade, water is actually denser than it is when it's ice. Ice floats, and we've talked about that before. So in spring, what will happen is that the upper regions actually warm. By warming, they actually become more dense, believe it or not, and then that will cause a circulation of the water in the spring. As summer progresses, the upper regions will get quite warm, and so the water will stratify according to temperatures, and these abrupt changes in temperature are known as thermoclines. And then as we go into fall or autumn, as again the surface waters cool, they will become more dense, and that will trigger another recirculation. So we tend to see a recirculation of water in the spring and fall, and stratification in winter and summer. Now, when we look at lakes, there are basically three types of lakes that we generally recognize: so-called oligotrophic lakes, mesotrophic lakes, and eutrophic lakes. And so I'd like you to look at a video that we taped previously up in Grand Teton National Park, where I talk about these three different types of lakes. I'm standing in the icy cold water of String Lake in beautiful Grand Teton National Park to tell you a little bit about one of the ways in which ecologists classify lakes, and that is according to nutrient density in the water. This lake I'm standing in is an example of an oligotrophic lake. The prefix oligo means few or little, and the word trophic is reference to the amount of food, and in this case nutrients in the water. And it is, as is typical of an oligotrophic lake, this water is crystal clear. This is a typical alpine lake. Drainage is coming off of the mountains behind me, off of granitic rock, and that drainage has very few nitrates and phosphates, which are important to the algae and aquatic plants in lakes. As a result, again, this water is crystal clear. There's very little plankton in it. There's very few aquatic plants. And as a result, the resulting food web is also highly depleted. So an oligotrophic lake not only is low in nutrients then, it also is low in productivity and low in total biomass. Now, the next step up from this would be a type of lake known as a mesotrophic lake. So meso is a reference to medium or intermediate. So it has a medium quality in terms of nutrient density, and here again we're talking about primarily nitrates and phosphates. And so since there are more nitrates and phosphates in the water, this then leads to more productivity, more algae, more aquatic plants, and then more organisms that can feed on those, greater biomass, greater productivity in that body of water. Now, I didn't have an example. Obviously, I was standing in an oligotrophic lake, but again, this is a look at least at what a eutrophic lake can look like, a lot of biomass here. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is this process of eutrophication. There is a natural transition which can occur from a eutrophic lake to a eutrophic lake that might take decades, literally. But there's also a process called eutrophication, which is not necessarily such a good thing. And this is usually an abrupt change or a rapid change in nutrient density, and it can create a rapid change in a lake and actually end up in something we call as a dead lake. So I'd like to kind of go through that process with you, and this is not necessarily a great thing to happen. So it begins with increased nutrients coming into the water. And again, primarily here we're talking about nitrates and phosphates. Those generally are the limiting nutrients for plants, aquatic plants, and algae. And this increase in nutrients is triggered typically by human activity. It might be sewage, for example. It might be runoff caused by clearing of vegetation. But you get a boost in nutrients. This then in turn will cause basically a population explosion of the algae. It's what we call an algal bloom. And so this might be microscopic algae, it might be larger algae, or even aquatic plants. This in turn really generally cannot be sustained. And so as we talked about before, populations can exceed their carrying capacity. Or another thing that can happen is that if you have an increased nutrients perhaps in spring with rains, and then the rains decrease and you don't have as much runoff, suddenly you don't have enough nutrients to support the algae that were growing there. And so then they will die off, and you get what's called an algal crash. And then as these aquatic plants and algae and microscopic algae die and sink to the bottom, that allows decomposers to begin feeding on them. And decomposers are heterotrophic like you and I, so that requires oxygen. So the downstream effect of that is that decreases oxygen in the water. If you're a fish living in that water, you suffocate. That leads to what we call a fish kill. Now, if you're a decomposer, you're loving that because now that's just more things for you to decompose. And so decomposer bloom continues. That continues to decrease oxygen supply in the water. And eventually, so much oxygen will be pulled out of the water is that basically all the heterotrophs will die, including the decomposers. And then this leads to and there's a step here that I've left out, but what that will lead to is an anaerobe bloom, a bloom of anaerobic bacteria. And at that point, we refer to that body of water as a dead lake. Now, is the lake really dead? Is nothing living there? Is there anything living there? And the answer is, yeah, there are some things living there. Anaerobic bacteria are living there. So if you're an anaerobic bacterium, it's a great place to live because there's virtually no oxygen in the water. But for everything else, it's really not a useful body of water. So a lot of times these dead lakes are kind of noxious and obnoxious in terms of smell and that kind of thing. They're not a very useful body of water. They're usually not a very pretty body of water. So again, this is a process that generally is the result of human activity and is hard to reverse. And so literally what you have to do in these situations is let the lake flush out, and that can take centuries to do that, quite honestly. So again, it is a process that's hard to reverse once it gets started. And it's generally triggered by development. So we develop an area, runoff increases that bring nutrients with it. Again, it might also be sewage. That's the consequence of development as well. And again, you can kind of see here in clear cutting a forest, and it relates to a lake, clear cutting occurred here, and then you see this incredible spike in nutrients entering the lake, and that would potentially trigger a eutrophic effect. Also, when you look at agriculture, a lot of fertilizers are used, and fertilizers contain, plant nutrients. I mean, that's what that fertilizers are, and so then those drain into lakes as well, and can trigger eutrophication. Now, we generally think of eutrophication as being an event with lakes, but it also has been happening in our oceans as well. Along the Gulf of Mexico, for example, every summer, what's happening is that you get a lot of runoff through the Mississippi River that brings a lot of nutrients with it, including fertilizers, from the agricultural land. And then that essentially creates dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. And the currents will eventually carry these dead zones off, and they'll basically travel through the Gulf of Mexico, suffocating any of the animals that live in those dead zones. So this used to be a rare event. It's now a common event. It's really an annual event in the Gulf of Mexico. There are some other dead zones around the Earth as well. And again, it's part of a consequence of global warming, but again, it's also a consequence of development and greater humanity. Now, lotic ecosystems are water that flows. So rivers, streams, all of those kinds of things would be different types of lotic ecosystems. And again, there are a number of different lotic ecosystems. Some somewhat related terms as well. An estuary is an ecosystem where you have a mixing of fresh and salt water. So these would be coastal regions. So you have tidal influx from the oceans, and then you also have runoff from rivers or streams meeting in low-lying areas. And so these are known as estuaries. And estuaries are very dynamic and important ecosystems, very productive ecosystems. A riparian system is one that we find associated with waterways. And so generally speaking, a riparian ecosystem can be very similar to the surrounding ecosystems, or they may be very different from the surrounding ecosystem. So again, here we would be talking about the vegetation associated with the banks of a waterway, and that would constitute a riparian ecosystem. So again, sometimes there's no significant change from the surrounding ecosystem. Sometimes it's a very different change. And one of the places where you'd see that would be in desert ecosystems. When you're in a desert, you can always tell where the water is because you'll see a lot of different types of vegetation there. You'll see trees growing instead of cacti. And then a wetland is, as the name implies, which is wet, either seasonally, part of the year, or perennially, which would be year-round. So here in Southern California, for example, we have wetlands called vernal pools, which really only form during the spring, if at all. Some years we may not even have these wetlands forming, but they are unique ecosystems. When they do form, it's just that they don't persist year-round. And then, as I mentioned, perennial wetlands would be things like swamps and bogs, which can last year-round. Now, also when we look at ecosystems, there are terrestrial ecosystems, also called biomes. And you may be a little more familiar with some of these. But when we look at the relationship between the physical and biological world here, basically climate, the geology, the makeup of the rocks and soil, the geography, the terrain, as well as latitude, where we are on the planet, these factors all influence the type of producers that we see in an ecosystem or biome. And in turn, the producers influence the type of consumers that we see. So we generally look at a kind of a downstream effect from the physical world to plants to animals. But there is feedback which goes on here. So the consumers in an ecosystem can have an influence on the type of producers that are there, again through overgrazing and so on. And they can even influence the physical makeup of their environment. So for example, bison, they like to form wallows and things like that. So they won't have a gross change on a major geographic region, but but in small ways they can change the geography of their local communities. So there is a little bit of feedback there. Likewise, producers can also feed back and potentially change the physical makeup of their world as well. Because again, if you have vegetation, it tends to hold soil, add to soil, and over time that will lead to changes in the ecosystem, which we refer to as succession. So it's not completely one way from physical to biological. There is a little feedback on the physical world there. And again, as we know from our human population, we may even be feeding back and altering climate, but we'll get to that later. So as we look at the major biomes then that we see, the terrestrial ecosystems that we see on the planet, one category would be deciduous forests. And these would be the broadleaf forests that we find around the world. In the United States, we're mainly talking about the eastern parts of the United States, the Northeast, even the Southeast. And so deciduous forests have trees then that will drop their leaves in the fall and winter and then regrow them in the spring. And so deciduous forests tend to have a moderate to high diversity, meaning quite a few different species. Also, when we look at the soils of deciduous forests, it's usually a pretty nutrient dense soil because, again, you would have dropping of the leaves every year, decomposition of that material, and then returning nutrients to the soil that can be used again in the next growing season. So generally speaking, pretty good soils, fairly high diversity. The coniferous forests, again, would be dominated by different types of conifers. And I should also mention that even within these major categories, there are a number of specific types. So within coniferous forest, again, lodgepole pine forest, blue spruce forest, and so on would be subcategories here. So the coniferous forests then are dominated by conifers. And conifers generally have perennial leaves, the needles stay year-round, so they don't produce a lot of humus in the soil, so the soil is usually actually fairly poor in quality. A lot of times you find conifers associated with mountains like the Rocky Mountain regions. And so anyway, conifers tend to have an advantage in some of the poorer soils compared to the deciduous forests. And here diversity tends to be moderate to low. So again, some of the conifer forests, when we go up to the Yellowstone ecosystem, for example, you'll look at the lodgepole pine forest there, and it's just amazing. Virtually every tree is a lodgepole pine. And it's because they happen to do really well in that particular soil. Now, grasslands would be dominated by grasses, obviously. And so the temperate grasslands are among the greatest soils in the world, quite honestly. So there's pretty high diversity here. I'd say moderate diversity in temperate grasslands. But because grasses grow annually and then die annually and then decompose annually, they contribute to a really high quality soil. So when you look at temperate grasslands, the temperate grasslands really have the greatest soils on Earth. And so there really are relatively few, certainly in the United States, there are very, very few regions where we actually have natural grasslands left, because what we've done is plowed them and used those for our croplands. So when you look at the really productive croplands around the world, most of the time those were grasslands. And again, temperate grasslands in our plain states are just incredibly rich soils, and so we've turned them into croplands. Now, another aspect of grasslands would be tropical grasslands. So tropical grasslands, or the savanna that you'd find in Africa, for example, again, are also very productive, good soils. They tend to be drier, though, so they'll have longer periods of drought. And so, that can be problematic, obviously, for the consumers living in those ecosystems. But if you can deliver water, to the savanna, it also can be a tremendously productive agricultural land as well. And again, here we tend to see, moderate to high diversity. Chaparral is sometimes referred to as a scrub forest, and so these are typically sagebrush type communities. And the chaparral ecosystem, certainly along the California coast, is a fire-adapted community. So here we're seeing, relatively mild winters, hot summers, relatively poor quality soil because you don't have a lot of leaf litter and decomposition going on. Diversity is, moderate to low. And again, since the soils are not real great, it's hard for the new generation to get started. And these plants also, since they're in fairly dry habitats, tend to store their excess food in the form of oils. And so anyway, they are prone to fire. So once fires get started, they burn very well because these aromatic oils will burn. And then that will clear off, the vegetation, and then that's what actually gives the next generation a chance to get started. Tundra. Again, tundra we normally associate with extreme latitudes, close to the Arctic or the Antarctic. And the true tundra is associated with permafrost, so you'll have soil that is frozen year-round at certain layers beneath the tundra. Also, these regions tend to exhibit high winds, so when you look at a tundra landscape, one of the real obvious features is that there's really a lack of trees. We're looking at low-lying vegetation. And again, here we're looking at relatively low diversity, and generally speaking, the soil quality is not terrific. And again, the big problem for them is permafrost. And so the reason you don't see trees is because trees can't put roots deep enough into the permafrost to be able to withstand the winds, and so they'll just get blown over. But certainly this is an area in transition, no question about it, and it's a really critical area in terms of global warming, because the permafrost is melting, and so there's a greater depth of unfrozen soil every year. And also then the decomposers are working there, also methanogens are working there. So we'll talk more about this when we talk global warming, but one of the real curiosities about how gross the warming could be has to do with the tundra. Because at this point we're not really sure whether the warmer temperatures potentially will add more growth, pulling more carbon out of the atmosphere, or whether methanogens and decomposers in that permafrost, what was previously a permafrost, will be decomposing vegetation beneath the surface and releasing more carbon dioxide. So this is a real critical area in terms of trying to predict what's going to happen in terms of warming. And then last but not least, tropical rainforests. And tropical rainforests are really the most diverse ecosystems, the most productive of the ecosystems. But ironically, if you were to look at the soil of a tropical rainforest, it's really a relatively poor soil. There's virtually no nutrients in the soil. And so the reason for that is that, again, it's an optimal place for growth. And so what tends to happen then is that as the leaf litter drops to the soil, it decomposes, nutrients get returned to the soil, and basically as fast as those nutrients get into the soil, they're sucked up and pulled out of the soil, by the vegetation. So again, we're looking at absolute optimal growing conditions in the tropical rainforest. And so the problem here then is that, as humanity expands here and so on, the tropical rainforest will be burned, often for cattle, ranching, or even farming. And again, you're also compounding this with 300 or 400 inches of rain a year, and so what topsoil you've exposed in will wash away. Even if it doesn't wash away, it won't sustain more than a couple of years of growth because the nutrients are so poor in that soil. So then you have to move to another part of the forest and burn that down and start over again. So that's it for today. We'll continue our discussion of ecology next time.